After showing promise at the junior club and international levels the last couple years, Noa Essengue took a significant step forward in contributing for Ratio Farm Ulm as a 17-18-year-old and continued that progression throughout the year. He's a 6'10 forward whose long strides, defensive versatility, and play finishing upside stand out the most, and his overall activity and production at his age has made him a prospect that's drawn a lot of long-term interest. Now, he's still an unfinished product who will need to continue developing physically as a shooter and just honing in on what he's good at, but that rate of progression and tools as the second youngest player in the draft make him one of the most appealing upside swings in the class. Now, there's a lot of interesting pieces to Noah's game, but his defense is what stood out most to this point. There aren't many teenagers his size who move with the type of ease and fluidity that he does, and this allowed him to be an effective cover on multiple positions and make his presence felt consistently already, even with some things still there for him to clean up. But starting on the perimeter, his ability to cover ground, recover to the ball, and use his length to impact shots has been impressive to watch. He'll primarily match up with 4s and some 3s in the league, but he spent time guarding basically every position and even full-on picked up point guards in the full court. Now, there's been some mixed results in that, but he's done a solid job of keeping up, applying pressure off the rebound, and switching seamlessly in the pick and roll to defend on an island. Despite being a notch under 200 pounds, he's embraced physicality to help finish possessions on the glass and done a relatively solid job defending bigger players and absorbing contact in the paint. He's not quite Chet Holmgren level in this aspect, who I would consider to be the true bar, but it is a big part of him finding a way to be effective, especially defensively, at a level that's full of grown men.
Looks like Coach Ty.
Raglands muss sein Dribbling aufnehmen. 11 Sekunden nur noch für diesen Angriff. Jetzt gegen Essengue. Ist jetzt nicht unbedingt der Switch, den ich mir raussuchen würde. Genau. Antonio Blakeney. Shot fake, 9 Sekunden.
Jedno mjesto ispod crte, 7. nisu ušli u doigravanje u kojem je na kraju.
Now, in help, he's been a solid playmaker, and his understanding for where to be on the floor has grown quite a bit over the course of the season. He's not the most bouncy, weak-side shot blocker. In fact, I think he'd be in a completely different category as a prospect if you could rely on him to do this in a more significant way, but he can give you something with his ability to cover ground and his standing reach. And then he has solid instincts to play passing lanes out on the perimeter and on the interior, coming up with deflections and steals, and that does a lot to set up his game in the open floor, which we'll talk about more here in a second. Ultimately, he has a lot of tools as a 6'10 forward who can cover ground, guard multiple positions, and isn't afraid of physicality. And even though there's still some stuff there for him to clean up, you got to be pretty intrigued by what he could become here in the future.
Schaffen. Das war ein optimistischer Pass.
Sa -5 vraćaju se gosti na -2. Valencia je broj 1. Ono je...
Loti direktno u ruke Noe Essengu.
Strong start to this second quarter, the youngster. Tanaskovic can't get it through to Omic. Another turnover. Essengue feeds Saraf, and Saraf.
ništa od toga, samo nastavak napada.
Gesprochen, Energizer. Stand ja viel in der Kritik, ob das wirklich ein Alba Berlin-Spieler ist.
Za Ulm. To je bio razlog zašto je...
Now, the most consistent and effective part of his offensive game right now comes in transition. He's a very fluid open floor athlete who changes ends and runs lanes well. He's made plays on defense with those deflections and steals we've talked about and turned them into easy opportunities. And then he'll get a long rebound or a contest and leak out, similarly to what you might see from a Pascal Siakam, for example. This is his second most common play type, in a spot that he shot nearly 80% from the field and averaged over 1.4 points per possession, which is pretty ridiculous for anyone, but especially someone that's just stepped into this level. Now, of course, this isn't always the most reliable source of offense, especially when the prospect isn't primarily pushing or controlling the pace themselves. However, I think this will be a defining piece of Noah's game and something that he can continue to replicate as long as the team isn't like the complete opposite in terms of style and pace.
Ist ein deutlich besserer Schütze als das hier mit dem Stil, dem Pass und Essengue mit den nächsten.
Sa 10-7 plus 3 u trećoj minuti. Kažem, unutar tih 6 poena se odvijala prva.
Showing good physicality, the young Romanian, and good finish inside as well as
now, in the half court, he definitely has some more questions to answer, but for the moment, he's done some positive things as a play finisher and projects fairly well there. He has good feel as a cutter and does a good job finding gaps in the defense, whether he's operating out of the opposite wing or corner, or even just roaming around the paint as the lone man on the interior. And he shot over 60% on labeled cuts, which is a solid clip. Now, he's not your traditional screen assist big that rolls and gives you a great target as a lob threat. Now, he's not your traditional screen assist big that rolls and gives you a great target as a lob threat, but he can be effective diving to the bucket and showing off great coordination and knowledge for where he's at on the floor. He also has soft hands and isn't afraid of physicality, despite being much skinnier than pretty much everyone that he's gone up against. That physicality and a knack for drawing fouls has been a big part of keeping him a relatively consistent floor offensively. Now, you could see this as an indicator that he has significantly more offensive upside to tap into, which he might. I'm not sure there's as direct a relationship here as some of the other successes we've seen because he's not a creation force in that same way, but again, he's embraced contact and it's definitely been a positive part of who he is. Now, with the cutting and movement out the ball, the soft hands and decent touch around the rim, also putting up about 70 dunks on the season, including half of them in the half court, I think he'll be able to replicate some of this in the league. Now, there could be some clunkiness there because he isn't a true 5, but as long as the spacing is made up for in the short term, he should be okay.
Zaraf i Essengue.
Two-man game with Saraf. Good ball movement, finds Essengue wide open down on the low block.
Essengue i Džezub zamalo gubi loptu, Essengue pod košem rješava i ovo.
Essengue, yeah, nicely done.
Now, to me, the most important area for improvement is his outside shooting. He's taken some necessary steps forward this year in terms of volume and comfort, at least adjusting for the level that he's playing at, but he's still quite a bit away from being a consistent NBA level shooter. He shot about 26% from 3 on about 2 attempts a game, and last year at the junior club level, he was at about 29% on 4 attempts and a significantly worse mark from the free throw line, so the priors just aren't positive. Now, mechanically, I don't think he's in bad shape. There's a lot that he needs to improve strength-wise that I think will ease some of this, and his shot prep definitely needs to get better, but he's fluid. He has a higher release point and doesn't have flaws that I think would be insurmountable. Now, granted, some of the variance in his misses means something is going on, but they're at least workable, and the improved free throw splits at a higher level could be more significant than we give credit. But again, for someone who doesn't provide exceptional value in the half court as a screener or above the rim lob threat, or is just an undeniable playmaker with the ball, having a reliable shot is going to be pretty important for him, to the point that if you have low confidence that he ever gets there, I don't think considering him in the top 10 or 12 would make much sense unless you're confident that he's like an all-league caliber defender.
Možda se upustiti borbu sa Bayernom.
Obviously they want to score, but they could take time out of the game with their possessions as well. Here's Essengue for three, makes it.
Now, because he's more of a forward slash wing and not a true big, there's a healthy level of concern in his lack of self-creation and ball skills. I actually like his handle a decent amount on grabbing goals and think the straight line stuff on closeouts has a ton of potential, which I want to spend some more time on here in a second, but he's fairly limited beyond that. He's not breaking people down and creating consistent advantages off the dribble. He doesn't have much of a pull-up beyond a few flashes, and his bag in the paint is fairly limited too, especially when it comes to bump fades or a hook or just asserting himself in the post in a significant way. He's also ended up with a handful of offensive fouls, and the lack of strength to really carve out angles hurts him right now. This could all be pretty limiting to his game offensively, both in the half court and just carving out a role that fits in more places, even if the shot does become respectable. Now, I would still be pretty excited about what he could do with this and the fluidity and stride length that he's showing on straight line drives off closeouts and even a few off of screens. He'd of course need to shoot it to unlock this a little easier, but I do think it's a separator between him and someone like an Asa Newell, for example. And the flashes that he's shown in the open floor are enough to stay intrigued about who he could eventually become in the future, especially if you can get him to turn the motor up just a little higher.
Početkom nastavka gosti su uspjeli doći na samom minutu. Dosta težak promašaj za 3, pa da nova prigoda i zamjena na samom čošku, u samom kutu ne iskoristi to. Jalen Smith zabio 3.
Stiže na kraju lopta do Herkenkofa, Noa Essengue s polu distance.
Now, while he isn't the best playmaker, I do think he's a much more clever and aware passer than the stats would let you know, and it's something that first stood out to me watching him last summer in the U18s with France. I think he'll be able to make all the extra passes and move the ball. He's made touch passes in transition with ease and should be able to run DHOs and make a play on short rolls. He seems to read the game well enough to find success in those areas. It's just going to be about passing placement and improving his timing for the speed of the NBA. You're still not getting much from him creating offense downhill or in the post. Sure, if he develops ball skills and physical tools in a way that transforms him, who knows, right? But you're at least not drafting him with that expectation because I just don't think it's rooted in much other than wishful thinking and maybe a slightly positive assist-to-turnover ratio.
Im Positiven wie im Negativen. Essengue, super Pass aus dem Short Roll für...
Yeah, nicely done.
Odličnih 58 od 16. Što se skoka tiče, 18-17 za goste plus 1, domaćin 5, gosti 6 za ravno.
Ni on se još nije razigrao. Essengue, malo prije pogodio, na vrijeme je šutirao. Mogao ići realno na tricu. Essengue, kud ovo ide.
Vilniusa, 6 sastava unutar 2 pobjede, 2 kola do kraja, kažem, sve je moguće i...
And finishing things up here, the other spot that'll be important for him is just cleaning up some things on defense. The physical element will be key here, as it is in a lot of spots for him, but I do worry that he could be one of those guys who can do a little bit of everything, but maybe doesn't have a true position or role that he excels at. A lot of that comes from him not being a complete presence at the rim, both rotationally and as a shot blocker. I mentioned some of this earlier, but I think things become drastically more compelling for him if he can first cut out the several lapses a game he has off the ball and then improve enough to take on some of those roamer responsibilities, even if it doesn't result in significantly higher block numbers. And then on the perimeter, he does a pretty good job of sticking around, but he's often putting himself in recovery and relying on his physical tools to keep up, rather than cutting off driving lanes with his anticipation and ability to absorb contact. It's enough to stick around and still switch just fine, and I think this is still a positive overall, but the standards are higher when we're talking about matching up on the wing and having to navigate screens and handle those creators in the NBA.
What's supposed to do with that, coach? What's Essengue supposed to do against the big giant that is George Condit? Run to start the second period. for Gran Canaria.
Now Noa is probably the biggest home run swing in this class. I think there's enough there to see a contributor in the future, but he's definitely a long-term play in a lot of ways. Offensively, he'll likely be more of a play finisher, someone who operates as a sort of combo forward, who cuts, rolls, spots up, and makes things happen off of advantage creators. There's at least some potential that he becomes more of a slasher in the half court and develops more of those ball skills, but that'll probably be down the line. Defensively, he should be an interesting piece as a guy who can match up with different wings and forwards. He'll be able to switch on to creators, and maybe he grows enough physically to handle some minutes at the 5. And overall, he's someone I think teams should be pretty experimental with on defense and allow him to grow over time. I think a lot is riding on his outside shot and where he goes physically. Obviously, there's some stuff in there creation-wise that could shift who he is, but if 6'10", 190 turns into 6'11", 225, 230, and so on, we're already talking about a much different player. So if some of those things come to fruition, I say high-level starter is at least in the picture. But on the lower end, I do think it's a little riskier just because he has some, but not the clearest elite skills or traits for an NBA role, especially offensively. I think he could land anywhere from like the mid-lottery to the late teens, and my favorite landing spots would be those that would be patient, so a Washington, a Brooklyn, maybe Chicago and Portland, and even in OKC is a longer term play as they make these runs, but somewhere in that range would be my ideal spot for him. Now this is one of those comparisons that you could take it or leave it because I'm not really sure. Some might say that's a bad indicator. I just think it's hard to make things match for someone like him, but I would say it's somewhere between like a Al Farouk Aminu and maybe a Jaden McDaniels most realistically. The North Star is probably like a Jeremy Grant to a Pascal Siakam. I think it's hard to expect that given where he's at currently, but both of those guys took a pretty long road to get to their very different but high level destination. So I think if you're picking him, that's the long-term aspiration. It just might be a little more realistic on those first couple. Noa Essengue is one of the class's biggest wild cards. He's young, a very intriguing mover at the 3 or 4 spot, and the fact that he's found a way to produce and be effective at his age is impressive. Now, early production has never guaranteed anything, especially when some important skills aren't there. But I think taking him as high as the late lottery is justifiable with patience, and to me, he's a step above some of the other recent mid to late lottery projects that have been taken.